Well guys, let's get the day started. Okay guys, we're back. Today we're going to be assembling the short block. As you guys could see from my other clips, it is freezing outside. That's why I'm bundled up so much. Got 4 layers on, but it's freezing outside. We got the case halves. I don't know if you can see, but there's little tiny ice crystals built up. So I'm gonna have to clean this all up a little bit. We got our brand new crank here, thanks to my boss. But today I'm going to be showing you guys the basic steps on how to reassemble this short block. Last couple of clips were of me disassembling it. This process is going to be a little bit longer, so please bear with me. I'll try to simplify it as much as possible, but if you guys have any questions about it or anything like that, please definitely let me know down in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them. Let me let my hands warm up a little bit. It's -9 degrees outside, so I'm gonna warm up here in the shop a little bit before I start, and then we're gonna go ahead and just get to assembling this. Okay guys, so first thing I like to do when assembling a block is start with the crank. EJ blocks are very different from all other blocks when it comes to assembly, because the crank and rods have to be assembled separately from the case halves and the pistons. You guys will see what I'm talking about in a minute, but we've got our IAG rods here, our King race rod bearings here, and I'm going to start with a quick disclaimer. All of these items, the crank, the rods, the cylinder bore, the piston to wall clearance, all that stuff has already been measured and clearanced and everything. So I'm not gonna sit here and go through all of the process of measuring every little piece. If you guys have questions about measuring stuff and everything, let me know down in the comments, or if you want me to make a separate video on that, let me know as well. I'd be happy to do it. It looks like these rods already have bearings in them. The bearings look fine, but I have no idea the history of them or the health of them or what they came off of or if they're new, etc., etc. So I'm just going to use brand new bearings. It's always a good practice. Never reuse bearings, whether they were out of a running car or not. They're cheap enough, you might as well replace them. So I've got the rod and rod cap apart. Going to remove these bearings. They were sitting in a bag of oil to keep them from rusting and everything, so I'm just going to take a lint-free cloth real quick. I'll show you guys. Just got a shop towel and just go through here and just really thoroughly clean up your rod and rod cap surface so that there's no oil. Because if you have any oil between your rod and your bearing, that's a good way to spin a bearing. So just going to go through and clean up all of these like this really quick. Okay, so we've got our bearings open. Super simple, just press it in there. Take your rod cap and do the same thing. You want to make sure that your notch here is lined up, or your tab is lined up with your opening. Easy enough. And then I'm going to take some assembly lube, just regular assembly lube, whatever brand you like, and just give the bearing surfaces some nice lubrication. This one's almost out, so bear with me. It's also freezing cold in here. Give that a good bit of lube. And then it doesn't really matter which one you start with. I've measured these journals. They are all pretty much exactly the same. So it doesn't really matter which rod goes to which journal. Normally, you would, if you had any variation in your rod journals, you would line up your smallest journal with your smallest inner diameter rod and rod bearing and kind of match them like that so that you had the best clearances. In this case, like I said, all of these journals are exactly the same. It's a factory brand new crank, so everything is ground exactly the same, very accurately. So I'm just gonna kind of throw these on in order. So we'll start with 4. Just screw these in by hand. Then you can zip it down. And I think the torque spec for these are the ARP 2000 rod bolts. Pretty sure they're the 3/8. The 7/16 ones are a little bit larger and they will require a higher torque, as well as the 626 rod bolts will require a higher torque. I think around 85 foot-pounds, but these are just the 2000 ARP 2000 bolts. When you buy new rods, it should come with a paper that tells you torque specs for each individual application, but I'm going to go ahead and torque these down. Torque spec is, I think, about 60 to 65 foot-pounds, so let's torque these down and we'll go ahead and do the same process for the rest of these rods. Okay, easy enough. Crank and rod assembly is together. It's assembled. That's the easy part done. Once you're done assembling, you want to make sure everything rotates smoothly. It's got a little bit of resistance, which is expected because everything in here is freezing cold and everything is kind of shrunk down a little bit. But if it has any binding or excessively loose play, then that's a sign that you need to probably either take things apart, clean it, and reassemble it, or check your torque specs, or check your clearances if you have too much play, things like that. So now that the crank and rod assembly is together, we can put that to the side for now, and we can work on gapping the rings, assembling the rings and pistons, and dropping the pistons into the cylinder bores. Now this step is optional to do now or to do after assembling the case halves. I personally like to put the pistons and everything in before I assemble the case halves. No particular reason, it's just how I've done it the entire time. So let's go ahead and put the crank to the side and we'll work on gapping the rings. All right, so mainly the two rings that you need to focus on gapping the most importantly are the top ring and the second ring. They're usually always labeled, and if they're not, they're pretty easy to tell the difference. The bottom ring is usually a dark matte gray kind of looking one. It's usually got a little dot right here. I don't know if you guys can see that, a little dot on the ring itself, and they've always got this beveled edge to them. So that will be the second ring, and then the top ring is usually a more shiny metallic finish, usually silvery looking, and sometimes they have numbers written on the top here so that you know which one's top and bottom, or which which way to orientate it. So if you guys can see that, they've got some numbers, 3.917. That's for the bore. So my bore is stock 97.5 millimeter bore. So these rings should be already pretty dang close to gapped where they need to be. So I just set it in there, kind of walked it around the edge to get it in there and everything. I'm going to take the piston face down and I'm going to stick it in there, push it down so that it's even. And then now that it's even, hopefully you guys can see that, but the gap is right there. So it looks way small for my liking right now. So we're going to take a file and file that down until the gap is a little bit bigger. What we like to use is these little feeler gauges, but it looks like that gap is way small. I'm going to measure it really quick just to make sure, but it looks like I'm going to have to file it down a little bit. So I'm assuming I'm going to have to do that for all of them, including the second rings, but we'll find out in just a second. Let me measure it with the feeler gauge and we'll see where we're at. Okay, so really quick, I measured it. We're at about 7 thousandths of an inch, or 0.18 millimeters. And for a stock street car, low to medium, mid, moderate boost build, I like to be around 23 to 25, 0.23 to 0.25 millimeters, or about 10 thousandths of an inch. The manly instructions come with instructions on how to measure or how to calculate what bore you need. It's right here. So if you guys are interested in that, I can take a picture of that and leave it on screen right now. But each piston will be different, so definitely use your guide for your pistons to calculate your bore, or to calculate your ring gap. I'm sorry, not bore, ring gap, to calculate your ring gap. Okay, after filing for a second, hopefully you guys can tell that ring gap is much more close to where I want it to be. So we're gonna call this one good, and I'm gonna start measuring the second rings, but it's basically the same process for all of them. So just follow that. Let's get these rings gapped and we can install the pistons. All right, now that ring gap is set for top and bottom rings, when I measured them, they looked to be already within spec, so didn't mess with those. But now that top and bottom rings are gapped out properly, we can go ahead and start assembling our pistons to install. So as you can see, there's a front arrow that will go toward the front of the block every time. So my case half is facing this way, so this arrow will go toward the front of the block. What you want is to install your second ring first. I wouldn't recommend doing it this way, but I don't have a ring expander tool, so I just slide it in down here in the second ring and spin it around. I've never had an issue with doing it this way, so I'm gonna keep doing it this way until I can't do it anymore. So we're gonna install the second ring first with the gap exactly straight up and down at the top of the piston, and we're going to do the opposite for the primary ring. So like I said earlier, the primary ring has those numbers on it, so that'll always be facing up. The second ring has that dot on it, and that will always be facing up. So primary ring, we'll put it this way, slide it in and just walk it around. I know some of you guys might roast me for doing it that way, but I've always done it that way and I've never had a problem. So then we're gonna flip it over. I like to flip it over anyways. And then you've got your oil ring, and your oil ring has this kind of wave pattern, and where it terminates or where they meet, you want it to make a W, not an M. So the W will always face up toward the top of the ring. So since I've got my piston upside down, I'm just gonna make the W and then flip it and install it in the oil ring gap down here. Now we have our oil scraper rings, and you have these indexing tabs along the ringland of the piston. So we're just going to find that indexing tab. I like to start the tab of the oil scraper ring in that, and then, like I said, just do the same thing as the other rings, kind of just walk it around until it's seated. Make sure that tab is indexed in that little space there, or else you could fold the oil scraping ring up onto the side of the piston and cause damage to your block, ruin your piston, ruin the rings, all kinds of bad stuff. So there's another gap there, so we'll take this tab on this one as well and do the same thing. Just set it in that tab and walk it around. Pretty straightforward stuff. Just be very slow, very careful not to bend or disform any of your rings. And from there, we can take one of our wrist pin clips, and since we have to put the piston into the cylinder before the wrist pin, you guys will see what I'm talking about. We actually have to install one of the wrist pin clips into each piston before we install the piston into the cylinder. I'll show you guys what I mean here in just a second. Let's get one of these out. Okay, so we've got our wrist pin clip. Need to get some pliers real quick. Just use some needle nose pliers. Pretty simple, straightforward. Take some needle nose pliers, pinch it together, and since we're going to put this in the front cylinder here, I'm going to install it in the back of the piston. So it'll go in this side. Since this is facing the front, this is going to be the side that's not going to be accessible once we get it all in there. So we're going to install this one now. That way when we put the piston in this cylinder, we will be able to slide the wrist pin in from the front, and the wrist pin won't slide all the way through, and we won't have to worry about trying to install that with the piston in the block. So when I do the next one, I'll explain that one as well. But now that we've got the piston all assembled, ready to go in, we're going to take our assembly lube. I'll adjust you guys a little bit. Take our assembly lube and just coat the outer ring of the cylinder, so that way everything slides in nice and easily. Now we take our piston ring compressor tool. These are really useful. They also have other tools that you can use that are just as good, but I personally like using this one. It's the best one I've found so far. Company 23 makes a cool one that we have. I'm not really sure where it is, or I'd be using that one right now. But so you just set it around there, tighten it down. I like to give it a couple readjustment smacks, wiggle it around a little bit, try and get one more click out of it so it's nice and tight. And what I like to do personally, I look at the bottom. If the bottom skirt of the piston is flush and touching the ring tool, then that means that none of your rings or anything have come out of their seats and that you've got a good compression all the way around of your rings. You can use a piston hammer, piston mallet, whatever you want to call it. I just use a big hammer with a wooden handle, soft wooden handle, Give it a couple taps. Give it a couple taps. I give it a couple taps so that the skirt is a little bit below the tool itself. That way I can set it in here, set it into the cylinder nice and easily. You want to make sure, let me show you guys, you want to make sure that arrow is facing the front of your block, like always. And then hopefully you guys can see this. Readjust you again, but I like to give a couple taps around the edge of the piston, the ring compressor, and I like to hold it really firmly up top with just enough space for the hammer to go in between, and go ahead and hammer your piston down into the cylinder. Nice and smooth. Piston is installed. Easy enough. I will show you guys what I do with the wrist pin clip for this one, because it's a tiny bit different, but it's basically the same concept. So I'll show you the wrist pin thing on this cylinder, but let's go ahead and get all of the pistons put in, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, I've got the piston for the other cylinder all put together, rings are in and everything. Like I said, I would explain to you guys the wrist pin clip situation. So since we're putting it in this rear cylinder, this would be cylinder 4, and the arrow is going to be facing toward the front of the block, we want to install the wrist pin in this side of the piston, because this side will not be accessible once we get the piston in from this wrist pin access hole here. So instead of having to mess with it with super long needle nose or whatever, I'm just going to install it now in this side, put the piston in. Now that we've got the pistons in, you can probably see them down in there. They all went in relatively smooth, but now we're ready to get the middle of the case halves all put together. I've got the bearings for the main bearings, and then we've got 4 O-rings. I'll show you guys here. We got these 3 O-rings, and we're going to put them here, here, and there. And then we've got this orange O-ring. All this stuff should come in your master gasket kit if you decide to buy one. We'll put those all there. I'm going to get these main bearings installed. Then we're going to put a really thin layer of RTV, or gasket maker, on this side of the case half, and then we'll put the crank in and we'll be ready to put them together.
We're fine.
Okay, all that RTV is smeared on. It's just a very thin layer. Something to pay attention to when you're putting RTV is you don't want it to come very close to these bearings. You guys might be able to see that I didn't put any for about, I don't know, like 1/8 of an inch right here next to the bearing on each side. And that is because when you mate the case halves, you don't want it to squish and go into this oil passage for the bearings and clog it up. But the RTV is on. I'm going to put some assembly lube here on the main bearings, throw the crank in, and then I'm going to go find some bolts and we'll be able to put them together. Alright, so case halves are together. I put the 2 case half bolts here on the front, 2 here on the side that I show you guys in disassembly, and then the 6 over here. Basically what all I'm going to do now, I tighten them down just enough to seat the case halves together correctly. What I'm going to do now is torque them down. I'm going to go through and do 22 foot-pounds on all 4 of these, and then 22 foot-pounds on all 6 of these, and then I think about 36 foot-pounds this side, and then 36 foot-pounds on this side, and then I'll go back and do a second check just to make sure all of them are torqued properly. And then the block is pretty much ready to put the wrist pins into the pistons, and it'll be good to go. So let's get these torqued down, and I will get to the process of showing you guys kind of how to put the wrist pins in. Okay, now that all of the case-half bolts are torqued down, we're ready to put the rest pins in. So what I like to do is turn my crank so that my rod lines up with my wrist pin access hole. You might need to move it up or down just a little bit to kind of get it in the right spot. But now that the rod is lined up with the piston hole, you can take soft rubber mallet, something soft, and punch your piston down until you see it also line up with the wrist pin access hole. Go down a little bit more, and then you take something and stick it in there and just make sure it's completely straight. I'm gonna need 2 hands, but I'll kind of walk you guys through this as I go. But you want to make sure your piston and your rod are all lined up in your wrist pin access hole, and then it's just a matter of tweaking things back and forth just a little bit at a time until you can get your wrist pin slid in all the way through and into your rod, or through your rod in your piston. So it's pretty simple, kind of hard to do with one hand while I'm filming. That's the process. I'm sure you guys can figure it out. I'm gonna go ahead and get these wrist pins in, and the block will pretty much be done. So let's get the last of these wrist pins in, and I'll come back to you guys.
It's only 6 degrees outside, but I still came to work with him. He's working on his car, right? His motor, his block. Right now.
Her block is over there with the spun bearing, the 2.5 with the spun bearing that I showed you guys. It's over there, so maybe we'll rebuild that one soon. But really quick, what I wanted to show you guys, I don't know, are you able to see that, babe?
This?
No, in here.
In there?
So I can put my hand through the bottom of the block and push this rod back and forth to line it up with the wrist pin hole, just to make it easier to line up that wrist pin. So just a quick tip, you can use your hand or an extension or something to push the rod from the bottom of the block to line up that piston hole.
From there to in there.
It slid in pretty easily, kind of notched into place. Now once I lined everything up, I'm just going to take an extension and hammer it all the way in. Before I put the wrist pin clip in, I want to make sure that it is in the rod. So I'm going to rotate my crank just a little bit back and forth just to make sure it goes up and down. As long as it goes up and down, you know your rod is connected, and you can go ahead and put your wrist pin clip in. There we go. All the wrist pins are in, pistons turn smoothly and everything. This block is pretty much ready to put the heads on. Just got to put the wrist pin covers back on when I get back to my house. You guys saw in a couple of clips ago that I had to drill out this bolt right here. Just drilled another hole in it, put a reverse tapper in it, and she's spinning right out nice and smoothly. Easy enough. Anyways, we'll get that out. Block's ready to take home. Got to put a rear main seal in it, put these covers back on and everything, and she'll be ready to put the heads on. All right, everybody. As you can see, it's still freezing in this garage, but we're home. We've got the block home. We've got the kerosene heater burning just to try and warm it up in this garage a little bit. But I'm just going to finish up a few small things on this block, and then that'll be the end of the video. I'm just going to finish up a few small things on the block, and it'll be ready to put the heads back on. So that's pretty much the end of the video, guys. Hopefully all of this information helped you somewhat, and hopefully you can learn something from it. If you did learn something from it, please subscribe to the channel. I'll be doing a lot more informational videos like this in the future. If you have any questions, definitely let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. If you want me to break down any specific part of the video, let me know. I'd be happy to do a separate video on specifics that you guys might be interested in or that I didn't cover in this one. But I really appreciate you guys watching. Like I said, hopefully you guys learned something. If you did, like the video, subscribe, share it with your friends, all that good stuff. It really helps me out, and I'm really trying to get monetized in 2024. So let's try and be more consistent. You guys stay on top of me for that. But that's gonna do it for this video, guys. There's the EJ one more time with the forged internals. So next video will be putting heads on and hopefully getting it all reassembled. But that's gonna do it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.